It was a typical day in Hollywood, a city known for its glitz, glamour, and endless buzz of celebrity culture. But beneath the sparkling surface, the struggles of everyday life were always there, hidden in plain sight. On this particular afternoon, Sandra Bullock, Hollywood's sweetheart, was on her way to a charity event, a cause close to her heart. She had spent years lending her time and resources to various charities, always striving to make a positive impact in the world. But little did she know, a small, seemingly insignificant encounter would soon challenge her perspective in a way she never expected. As she made her way down the sidewalk toward the event, Sandra was suddenly stopped by a young boy, barefoot, ragged, and wearing an expression of uncertainty mixed with desperation. He was just a child, no older than 10, and his eyes met hers with quiet desperation. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly. "Can you spare just $1? I'm really hungry." The simplicity of his plea, combined with the innocence of his age, pierced Sandra's heart. Before she could even respond, something remarkable happened. Keanu Reeves, a figure of quiet kindness, stepped in, and what followed left the crowd frozen, reminding everyone of the power of true compassion. It was a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day that made the city's streets shimmer under the bright sun, drawing crowds of people out into the open. Sandra Bullock, as graceful and approachable as ever, was walking toward a well-known venue where a charity event was taking place. The event, aimed at raising awareness and funds for homeless children, was a cause very close to her heart. For years, Sandra had dedicated herself to supporting various charities, especially those focused on children's welfare. She had always been drawn to the idea of making a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable, and this event was another opportunity to do just that. As she approached the venue, the familiar scene unfolded. Fans gathered on the sidewalks, eager to catch a glimpse of their favorite actress. Photographers clicked away, capturing her every move as she made her way toward the entrance. The crowd cheered, and Sandra, as always, greeted them with her signature warmth and kindness. She smiled, signed autographs, and took a moment to connect with the people who had come out to see her. The anticipation for the evening's festivities was palpable, and Sandra couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment as she walked closer to the entrance of the venue. Dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, a soft, cream-colored blouse, paired with black trousers and flats, Sandra looked effortlessly chic. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her natural beauty shone through. Even with all the attention and noise surrounding her, there was a calmness to her demeanor. It was clear that despite her fame, she was fully invested in the cause she was supporting. But as she continued to make her way toward the venue, a scene unfolded in front of her that no one could have expected. She walked past a busy street corner, not noticing a small figure standing off to the side. The noise from the crowd and the hustle of the city momentarily distracted her, and she was about to continue forward when something caught her eye. As she got closer, she noticed the boy, a young child no older than 10, standing alone just a few feet away from the sidewalk. At first glance, the boy seemed unremarkable, just another person among the many who had become a fixture on the streets of Los Angeles. But as Sandra looked closer, her heart sank. He was barefoot, his clothes tattered and worn, his small frame clearly showing signs of neglect. His hair was matted with dirt, and his face, though young, carried the burden of a life much too hard for someone so small. He was standing with his hand outstretched, a silent plea for help. As Sandra slowed her pace, she saw the boy's face, an expression that was a mixture of uncertainty, hunger, and a deep sadness that no child should ever have to experience. His eyes, wide and desperate, looked up at her as though she were his last hope. For a moment, Sandra thought she might be imagining it, but the boy's quiet voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I please have just one? I'm hungry." Sandra stopped in her tracks. The words felt like a punch to the gut. She had spent years in Hollywood, surrounded by both affluence and poverty, and she had seen homeless individuals begging for spare change countless times. She had done what she could, donating to charities, volunteering her time, and speaking out for those in need. But seeing this child, this vulnerable, ragged boy standing on the edge of the world and asking for a mere dollar, was different. It was different because it wasn't just a homeless person asking for help. It was a child who shouldn't have to beg, who shouldn't have to be in such a desperate position. Sandra looked down at the boy, her heart heavy. The sight of him, his clothes worn and dirty, his face tired and full of longing, tore at her heartstrings. She could see the deep vulnerability in his eyes, the kind that only comes from having to grow up too quickly in a world that has left you behind. She scanned his ragged clothes, old jeans with frayed hems, a faded shirt, and a jacket that was far too thin to protect him from the chilly nights ahead. His feet were bare, the soles of his feet hardened from the rough pavement, and Sandra couldn't help but feel a deep, aching sense of helplessness. For a moment, she stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. She was caught between wanting to help, wanting to give this boy something to ease his hunger and suffering, and the overwhelming feeling that nothing she did would be enough. She had money in her wallet, of course, but the issue wasn't just about handing over $1. The issue was much larger than that, a systemic problem that could not be solved by a single act of kindness. But as the boy's eyes stayed fixed on her, waiting patiently, Sandra felt something inside her stir. This wasn't just a child on the streets asking for change. This was a human being, a child who deserved so much more than the world was giving him. Her instincts screamed at her to do something, to help in any way she could. But Sandra also understood that charity without real change was a temporary fix at best. Still, in this moment, her heart won out. She crouched down to his level, meeting his gaze and offering a soft, reassuring smile. "Hey," Sandra said gently. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Jake." "Well, Jake," Sandra said, her voice filled with compassion, "I'm going to help you." She fished through her wallet, pulling out a few bills, but as she did, a sudden thought crossed her mind. She didn't just want to give him money and walk away. That wouldn't solve the problem. She needed to help him in a more meaningful way. Before Sandra could say another word, the boy spoke again. "I just want something to eat. I don't need much." Sandra felt her throat tighten as she looked into his eyes. She could see the sincerity in his voice, the simple truth that all he wanted was to fill his stomach for the night. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, making her acutely aware of the disparity between their lives. It was a stark reminder of the world she lived in, a world where children like Jake often had to fight for survival in a city built on excess and privilege. Without thinking, Sandra reached for her phone, quickly dialing a number. As she waited for the call to connect, she made a promise to herself. She would not let this moment slip away without doing something tangible to help him, something more than just a few dollars. She would find a way to ensure that this boy, this child, wasn't left alone to navigate a harsh world without support. Jake didn't know it yet, but this was the moment his life was about to change. And as Sandra waited for the call to connect, she knew she had just made the first step in changing the course of someone's life for the better. Before Sandra could find the words, the boy spoke again, his voice cracking with the weight of his situation. "Please, ma'am," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm really hungry. I just need $1 so I can buy something to eat." Sandra's heart sank as she looked into the boy's eyes, which were filled with desperation and innocence. She could see the fatigue etched in his young face, the kind that only hunger and hardship could create. His clothes were worn and dirty, and his tiny feet were bare, the soles marked with the signs of life on the streets. The child's plea, so simple yet so heavy with meaning, hit her like a ton of bricks. She'd spent her life surrounded by privilege and opportunity, but here was a child, barely 10 years old, asking for just $1 to survive. The weight of his words didn't just break her heart. It made her realize how little this world sometimes cares for its most vulnerable. Sandra stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She was used to this kind of scene, people asking for help on the streets and restaurants on the sidewalks of Los Angeles. But this wasn't just another encounter with a homeless adult. This was a child, standing in front of her, vulnerable, and in need of something so basic. In that moment, the world around her seemed to blur, and her focus was entirely on the boy. She could feel a knot form in her stomach, a mixture of frustration and helplessness. How could she just walk away from him? Sandra's hand instinctively reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the edge of her wallet. She pulled it out, but before she could pull out any money, a voice from behind her interrupted. "Get out of here, kid," a man snapped, stepping forward with a sense of authority. His tone was harsh and his eyes scanned the scene with evident annoyance. He was clearly a part of the event Sandra was attending, perhaps a security guard or an event organizer. But whatever his role, his approach was entirely wrong. "You're ruining the atmosphere for everyone," he continued dismissively. Sandra's heart skipped a beat as the words hit her like a cold wave. The man's response was so unnecessary, so cruel that she couldn't help but feel a surge of anger rise inside her. How could anyone treat a child like that? How could someone speak to a homeless child who was simply asking for $1 with such disdain? Sandra quickly turned her head to the man, her body tense with indignation. She wanted to say something, to tell him off for his cold-heartedness, to remind him that this boy was not some nuisance to be swept away. But before she could open her mouth, something unexpected happened, something that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. From the crowd, a calm, familiar figure stepped forward. Sandra's eyes widened in disbelief as she recognized him immediately. Keanu Reeves, the actor known for his quiet strength, humility, and unwavering kindness. He had been standing just a few feet away, observing the situation unfold, and now he was walking toward them with his usual composure. Sandra didn't know what to expect, but she knew that whatever Keanu did next, it would be something that reflected his character, something that would speak to the very heart of human decency. The man in the suit didn't seem to notice Keanu approaching. His back turned to the actor as he continued to scold the boy. Keanu's calm demeanor, however, was impossible to ignore. As he reached the man, he gently but firmly placed a hand on his shoulder, causing the man to stiffen. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice quiet but commanding. "That's not how we treat children." The man turned, clearly caught off guard by the sudden presence of the actor, and took a half-step back. He looked Keanu up and down, as if unsure how to respond to someone of his stature. I'm just trying to keep the event on track," the man stammered, clearly trying to justify his actions. Keanu's gaze was steady, his tone unwavering. "That child is hungry," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And he deserves the same respect and compassion as anyone else here. You don't know what his life is like, but you can choose to show kindness." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who understood the power of empathy and kindness. The man, now visibly embarrassed and flustered, glanced down at the boy, who was standing with his head lowered, eyes fixed on the ground. The harsh words from the man had clearly wounded him, and Sandra could see the effect it had on his spirit. The child, so small, so vulnerable, didn't deserve to be dismissed in that way. Sandra, still shaken by the moment, finally spoke up. "Keanu's right," she said, her voice filled with quiet but palpable strength. "This is a child, and he deserves help, not scorn. There's no excuse for treating him like that." The man's face flushed, and he mumbled a quick apology before retreating, his pride clearly bruised by the situation. As he walked away, Keanu turned to the boy, his face softening with kindness. He kneeled down to the child's level, looking him in the eyes with a gentle smile. "Hey, buddy," Keanu said, his voice full of warmth. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up, startled at first, but the sincerity in Keanu's eyes seemed to put him at ease. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, handing them over to the child. "Here's some money for food," he said. "Go get yourself something good to eat. You don't have to ask for just ones, you deserve more." The boy, overwhelmed and speechless, reached out and took the money, his eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, Sandra saw a glimmer of hope in his expression, something that had been missing before. The weight of his struggle seemed to lighten just a little, as if the simple act of kindness had made him feel seen again. The boy nodded shyly, tears welling in his eyes, before mumbling a quiet, "Thank you." Keanu smiled warmly at him. "You're welcome, kiddo. Take care of yourself." As the boy walked away, Sandra felt a sense of gratitude that she couldn't quite put into words. Keanu's intervention had done more than just offer a meal to a hungry child. It had reminded everyone in the vicinity that compassion, respect, and kindness are not only the bare minimum, they are the foundations of humanity. What had started as a tense and uncomfortable moment had been transformed into something meaningful, something that would stay with everyone who witnessed it. Sandra looked at Keanu, her heart full of admiration. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that, but you did." Keanu shrugged, his modesty shining through. "Sometimes you just have to step in. We all need to do our part." As the event continued inside, Sandra carried with her not only the message of the cause she had come to support, but the powerful reminder of how even the smallest act of kindness can make the biggest difference in someone's life. The situation quickly escalated, and Sandra could feel her stomach tighten with discomfort. The boy, clearly frightened by the sudden confrontation, stepped back, his small frame shaking as he tried to hold back tears. His eyes, wide with confusion and fear, glistened with the weight of his situation. He was just a child no older than 10, standing on the harsh streets of Los Angeles, asking for help. But instead of sympathy or understanding, he was met with the harsh scorn of an adult. His face crumpled as the tears threatened to spill, and it was all Sandra could do not to reach out and comfort him. She watched helplessly, feeling a pang of guilt for not reacting sooner. The scene was unfolding so quickly, and she had been frozen for a moment, unsure of how to navigate the situation. The anger building in her chest made it hard to think clearly. She had seen this kind of coldness before, but never directed at someone so small, so vulnerable. The words from the man in the suit were cutting, harsh, and as she glanced around at the gathering crowd, she noticed that no one seemed to be stepping forward to intervene. Sandra knew that something had to be done. She couldn't just stand by and watch this child suffer any longer. But before she could speak, something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. Out of nowhere, Keanu Reeves, who had been standing nearby and observing the scene, began to walk toward them. Sandra's eyes widened, in recognition. Keanu, ever the image of calm and collectedness, seemed to exude a quiet energy that was both reassuring and powerful. His easygoing demeanor shifted in an instant. Where once he had been standing off to the side, merely a bystander, he now moved with calm determination, his gaze fixed on the boy, then on the man in the suit. It wasn't an aggressive move. It was deliberate, quiet, and measured. He didn't rush to the scene, didn't make a grand show of his arrival, but it was clear that something had shifted the moment he stepped in. Keanu walked confidently, but not with the intent to overpower. He wasn't here to escalate the situation. He was here to restore balance and humanity to a moment that had gone wrong. The crowd, once murmuring in confusion and surprise, grew silent as Keanu's presence seemed to command the room. Without hesitation, Keanu stepped directly between the boy and the man in the suit. The gesture was simple but profound. He was creating a physical barrier, a protective space around the child who had been so unjustly treated. The man in the suit paused, blinking in surprise. For a split second, it was clear that he hadn't expected anyone, let alone Keanu Reeves, to stand up for the child. Keanu didn't need to raise his voice. His authority wasn't based on volume or force. It was based on quiet strength and compassion. With his eyes locked on the man, Keanu spoke softly, but the words were heavy with meaning. "You don't speak to him like that," he said, his tone unwavering. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet firmness that made the man's condescension look all the more out of place. The man, clearly flustered and caught off guard by this sudden confrontation, opened his mouth to retort, but the words never came. Instead, he stood there, momentarily stunned by the calm intensity that Keanu radiated. Keanu didn't let him gather his thoughts or find a quick excuse. He simply continued, his voice steady and filled with quiet authority. "This child asked for help," Keanu said, his gaze never leaving the man. "He's not here to ruin your evening. He's simply hungry. You're in a place of privilege. You don't have the right to treat him like that." His words were gentle, but they carried an undeniable weight. The man, now visibly flustered and unsure of how to respond, stood frozen. His defense faltered in the face of Keanu's quiet conviction. There was no argument to be made, no justification for the cruelty that had been directed at the child. The man's face reddened with embarrassment as the realization began to settle in. He had misjudged the situation entirely. But what was more striking was how Keanu had done it. He had spoken the truth, not with anger, but with a quiet authority that commanded respect. There was no need for shouting or aggression. Keanu's calm presence alone had shifted the atmosphere, and in doing so, had reminded everyone around him of their shared humanity. The crowd, which had been murmuring uneasily moments earlier, now stood in stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as though time had slowed and everyone in the vicinity was holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Keanu's words had cut through the tension like a knife, and the power of his quiet intervention was enough to leave the crowd frozen in awe. Sandra, who had been standing just a few feet away, felt a rush of relief wash over her. She had been about to speak up herself, but Keanu had taken control of the situation with such grace that she didn't need to. What he had done wasn't just a small act of kindness. It was a profound display of how to stand up for what is right, without raising your voice or resorting to aggression. Keanu had made it clear that kindness, dignity, and respect were not optional, they were essential. The man in the suit, now completely flustered and unsure of how to respond, mumbled something. Incoherent. His bravado had dissolved in the face of Keanu's calm, dignified stance. Unable to find a way to justify his actions, he muttered an apology, turned, and quickly walked away, leaving the boy standing there, still holding his ground. Keanu, turning back to the boy, knelt down to his level, offering him a soft, reassuring smile. His face, normally calm, was now filled with warmth and kindness. "Are you okay?" Keanu asked gently, his voice full of empathy. The boy, still wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the entire encounter, nodded slowly, though his expression remained cautious. Keanu smiled again, his kindness evident in every movement. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "It's okay." The boy looked at him, as if processing the fact that someone had not only stood up for him, but had made him feel seen and valued in a way that had never happened before. For a moment, Sandra could see the vulnerability in the boy's eyes soften, replaced by a tentative glimmer of trust. Keanu's actions, his unspoken message of care and respect, had given him something he hadn't had in a long time, a sense of worth. As the boy slowly walked away, Keanu stood up, glancing at Sandra with a modest smile. "Sometimes all it takes is to step in," he said simply. Sandra nodded, deeply moved by the quiet strength he had displayed. Keanu had not only prevented a potentially devastating moment from escalating further, but he had also reminded everyone present that kindness and integrity were more powerful than any forceful confrontation. With a few words and a simple act of intervention, Keanu had shown that standing up for what's right didn't require shouting or aggression. It required courage, compassion, and a willingness to protect those who need it the most. Keanu, with a sense of quiet confidence, turned back to the boy. The noise around them seemed to fade as he knelt down to the child's level, looking him directly in the eyes. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of urgency or impatience. It was as if time had slowed down, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was the connection between the two of them. Keanu's gaze was soft yet firm, a reflection of the kindness and empathy that defined him. "Hey," Keanu said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "I know things are tough, but you're not alone. We're going to make sure you get something to eat." His words, though simple, were laced with genuine care and understanding. It wasn't just about offering food. It was about offering comfort. A promise that the boy wasn't invisible, that he wasn't just another face in a crowd of people who passed him by every day. The boy, still standing frozen in place, blinked up at Keanu, his wide eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion, hope, and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed as though he couldn't comprehend what Keanu was saying. It wasn't just the promise of food. It was the recognition that someone cared, that someone saw him for who he truly was. The boy had asked for something as small as $1, and yet Keanu's offer was far greater, a gift that wasn't just material, it was emotional and human. Keanu's hand slipped into his pocket, and he pulled out a $20 bill, holding it out to the boy with the same calm, steady gaze. The boy's eyes widened even more, and he hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of what to do. His fingers twitched, as though the idea of accepting such an offer was too good to be true. His whole life had been spent navigating through rejection, neglect, and survival. He wasn't used to kindness, not this kind, not in such an open and direct way. He had probably been dismissed or ignored more times than he could count, so the idea of someone offering him something without judgment or expectation was almost beyond his grasp. Keanu noticed the hesitation, the slight uncertainty in the boy's eyes, and his smile deepened, gentle and warm. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice unhurried. "Take it. It's for you." There was no pressure, no sense of urgency. Keanu wasn't giving the boy money out of obligation. He was giving it as an act of simple humanity, a gesture to restore the dignity that had been stripped away from him by a world that often turned a blind eye to the vulnerable. The boy, still processing the kindness being offered to him, slowly reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the bill. For a moment there was no sound, only the soft rustle of the wind and the distant hum of the city around them. The boy took the money, clutching it tightly in his small hand as though the physical act of holding it somehow solidified the idea that he was worthy of something more than just survival. He nodded slowly, his face still holding a mixture of confusion and gratitude. His lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, a single tear welled up in his eye and slid down his cheek, a silent expression of the relief and emotional release he felt in that moment. Keanu stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact with the boy, and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice still full of that quiet strength and warmth. It was clear that Keanu's actions weren't just about the money. The money was just a tangible part of what he had given. The real gift was the sense of humanity and compassion that had been shared. Keanu had seen the boy not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, but as a person deserving of care and respect, just like anyone else. Sandra, who had been watching the entire interaction from a few feet away, felt a wave of emotion rise inside her. The simple act of kindness before her left her breathless, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something that stirred her soul. She had seen kindness in many forms over the years, especially through her charitable work. But what Keanu had just done wasn't just about giving money, it was about restoring a sense of dignity to a child who had clearly been overlooked and ignored for far too long. Sandra had witnessed countless moments of generosity, many of which had been grand and well-intentioned, but this was different. This wasn't about a donation made to a charity or a large gesture of public kindness. This was a quiet, private moment of grace between two people, one with the power to give and the other with the simple need to receive. Keanu hadn't tried to fix the boy's entire world with a grand gesture. Instead, he had given him exactly what he needed in that moment: validation, respect, and the recognition that he mattered. As the boy walked away, clutching the $20 bill tightly in his hand, Sandra's eyes followed him. She watched as he looked back once, offering a shy, tentative smile, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of the world. For a moment, she could see the boy's world shift. He wasn't just a homeless child asking for money anymore. He was a child who had been seen and cared for, a child who had been given the opportunity to have something more than the harshness of life on the streets. Keanu, standing quietly beside Sandra, turned to her with a modest smile. "Sometimes it's just about being there for someone," he said, his voice still soft but filled with deep sincerity. Sandra nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've just changed his life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Keanu shrugged, ever humble. "I didn't change his life. I just gave him a moment where he felt seen." Sandra felt the weight of his words. It was true. Keanu's act wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was powerful because it was genuine. It was a reminder that even in a world full of noise, complexity, and distractions, the smallest acts of kindness could have the greatest impact. A simple gesture, whether through a smile, a kind word, or a $20 bill, could shift someone's reality even if just for a moment. That moment was more than enough for a boy who had been struggling to be noticed. As Keanu and Sandra watched the boy disappear into the crowd, Sandra realized that the world needed more people like Keanu, people who understood that the real power of kindness lay not in grand gestures but in the simple, everyday moments when we show others that they matter. As the crowd around them began to murmur, the energy in the air shifted dramatically. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable scene began to transform into something far more powerful, an atmosphere of warmth and empathy. It was as if Keanu's calm intervention had wiped away the coldness that had briefly descended over the group. The harsh words from the man in the suit, the fear in the boy's eyes, and the discomfort of those who had watched silently, all dissolved in the face of Keanu's simple but profound act of kindness. Keanu had turned what could have been a moment of anger, frustration, and division into a moment of grace, a reminder of the power of humanity in its simplest form. The man in the suit, who had previously stood with a sense of entitlement, his anger evident, now seemed deflated. His posture shifted, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions hit him. He had been too quick to judge, too quick to dismiss the child without understanding his situation. Now the man realized that he had been wrong, and Keanu's words, calm yet piercing, had made that abundantly clear. The man cleared his throat, a subtle apology rising to his lips. He mumbled it, almost too quietly, but it was enough. He knew he had no ground left to stand on. There was nothing left for him to say to justify his treatment of the boy. With an awkward glance at the crowd, he retreated, his figure disappearing into the distance, leaving a feeling of quiet resolution in his wake. The crowd that had gathered around the scene, once uncertain and uneasy, began to shift too. There were no grand gestures, no applause, but the collective energy felt different. The murmuring that had started with confusion and judgment had now transformed into murmurs of understanding and quiet appreciation. People who had been mere onlookers were now aware of something much larger than just the incident. They had witnessed the power of standing up for what's right, of showing kindness in the face of injustice. Keanu had shown them that change didn't always come from loud confrontations or big speeches. Sometimes it came in the form of one person simply stepping in to make a stand, with calm and quiet strength. Keanu stood up from his crouched position, his movements fluid and natural. His eyes moved briefly toward the boy who was still standing there, the $20 bill clutched tightly in his small hand. The boy, still processing what had just happened, gave a small, shy smile. His expression was no longer one of fear or desperation, but of tentative hope. It was a look Sandra would never forget, a look that said, "I matter." Keanu had done more than give him money. He had given him dignity, respect, and a reminder that he was seen in a world that too often ignored children like him. Turning back to Sandra, Keanu offered a reassuring smile. The same calm, gentle smile that had been a constant throughout the entire interaction. His humility, his quiet strength was evident in every gesture, in every word. "No one should be treated like that," Keanu said, his voice calm but filled with quiet conviction. His words weren't just directed at the man in the suit. They were a reminder to the crowd and to Sandra that this kind of treatment, this kind of dismissal of another human being, was never acceptable. Sandra, still shaken by the intensity of the moment, felt a deep sense of admiration and gratitude for Keanu. Her voice, thick with emotion, was barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said quietly, her gaze steady on him. "You didn't have to do that." Keanu simply smiled, his characteristic humility shining through in the way he brushed off the praise. Sometimes, the right thing to do is the simplest, he said. His words, though simple, carried a deep truth. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had just done what was right, and in doing so, he had made all the difference. As the boy slowly walked away, a small but genuine smile now on his face, the crowd seemed to come alive with a renewed sense of kindness. The moment had sparked something in them, a collective humanity that had been momentarily forgotten. People who had been so quick to judge, so ready to dismiss the situation, were now left with a sense of reflection. The power of one person's act of compassion had rippled out to touch everyone around them, leaving a lasting impact. Keanu's reaction, his ability to remain calm and firm in the face of something so unjust, had done more than just help a homeless child. It had reminded everyone of the importance of compassion, respect, and standing up for what is right, even when it seems small. In a world that often feels indifferent, moments like these prove that kindness still has the power to change lives. The crowd that had been gathered, unsure of how to respond to the initial confrontation, now stood in awe of Keanu's calm intervention. It wasn't the typical Hollywood spectacle. There were no loud speeches, no dramatic gestures, just a simple, quiet act of kindness in the face of injustice. Keanu's actions didn't require recognition, but they had sparked something that went far beyond the immediate moment. Sandra, standing quietly beside him, felt deeply moved, not only by his intervention but by the ripple effect it had caused. As the boy disappeared into the crowd, his steps lightened by the kindness shown to him, Sandra turned to Keanu once more. "You've changed the entire energy of this moment," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Keanu shrugged, ever humble. "We all have the ability to change the energy. It just takes one person to make the first move," he replied. And with that, Sandra realized that the story wasn't just about a homeless child or a famous actor. It was a reminder of the power of empathy and how one person's reaction can change the lives of others. Keanu's calm intervention had left the crowd frozen for a moment, but it also left them inspired. The simple act of standing up for what was right had left an indelible mark on everyone present, reminding them that kindness could still make all the difference in a world that often feels too divided. In the end, it wasn't just about the money or the charity event. It was about the humanity that connected everyone in that moment. Keanu had shown them all that, no matter who we are or where we come from, we all have the power to make the world a better place by simply doing what is right when it matters most.